Hello Year 10 and welcome to your first video on Lord of the Flies in what will be a series of videos to walk you through a range of different approaches to the text. What we've got today is a close exploration of a passage from chapter 1 of Lord of the Flies that I'd like you to do at home, followed by a thematic exploration where we're going to trace a range of different themes across the novel, but we're going to start with the passage that we've looked at really closely. We're going to be centering our focus on our study and our discussion around the theme of democracy, but from that comes a close examination of order versus chaos, as well as questions of power and the abuses of power that run throughout this novel. These are real profound interests for Golding in his Allegory, because he's living in a world post-World War II, after some of the most horrendous abuses ever committed against nations and peoples, as well as in the shadow of what can happen when tyranny is allowed to run out of control. So, without much further ado, we'll start looking at this passage and start tracking and tracing these ideas across the novel so that you can really start to deepen and take further your initial study and initial reading of this novel. So, we have this passage from chapter 1 of Lord of the Flies. This is the moment at which Ralph is voted leader of the boys on the island, is voted to be chief, and we're going to be looking at three themes: democracy, questions of power and abuses of power, as well as order versus chaos. So we're moving from your initial reading of the text where you got to grips with the core points of plot and narrative and who the characters are, how they function, their relationships, and now we're moving towards a closer focus on representation, what these characters represent. And this is particularly important for Lord of the Flies because this is, after all, an allegory. It's a novel full of symbols that stand for a range of different meanings, different ideals, and different ideas. And this is what I want us really to focus on with the first of our key symbols of the conch, this beautiful shell that's found on the island that Piggy identifies. And Golding assigns the central meaning to the conch as this representation of democracy and democratic values, these Western values that had been placed under threat during World War I and as a result of the threat posed by the Nazi regime that was defeated. With this focus on democratic values, and with each person who holds the conch being given a voice, this is initially a tool to give all voices on the island a chance to be heard. And it should be, with that in mind, a tool for equality. But equally, there's a second meaning that comes with this. There's a second warning that's assigned and aligned with the symbol of the conch. So yes, it's representative of democracy, but it's also aligned to power. And particularly in the opening stages of the novel, whoever holds the conch is the person who has power and control. And we see this in this second sentence here. Seems to me we ought to have a chief to decide things. And he says this after lifting the conch. So whoever has the conch then has power. And that means that there is a hierarchy of power on the island. And when we follow that conch through, in fact, by the end of the novel, it's destroyed and it's broken into 1,000 pieces. Democracy is shattered and destroyed by the end of the novel, which aligns and runs alongside the increasing chaos and carnage that we see the boys do to one another and the natural habitat of the island as a whole. In that sense, then, perhaps the representation is that democracy is just a veneer. It's just superficial, and it's temporary, and it's easy to destroy, and it's fragile. And the fragility of democracy seems to be an issue that Golding is initially introducing here and comes back to and intensifies as the novel progresses. Now, I've just focused in on this sort of under-commented on area here, this repetition of a chief, the boys as a whole, just repeating the mantras of the older, more vocal leading figures, the leading boys. It's almost like they're a mob, even at this early stage, that they all have one single voice rather than individual voices, and it's almost as though they've been whipped up to respond in a particular way. And this sort of idea of the mob following a singular leader is the opposite of democracy. It should be the opposite of what the conch stands for, but already we're starting to see the mob of the boys rather than a group of young gentlemen of the public schools of Britain in the 50s. We highlight also that the arrogance of Jack. And Jack is aligned with representations of the upper class and the pre-existing powerful figures of society. And there is this immediate contrast between the choristers and Jack and Piggy, who is portrayed as this lower class character. And Jack believes he should be chief because he's a chapter chorister, he's head boy and can sing in C sharp. There is that sense of entitlement and arrogance there. But none of the skills he gives as examples, the skills he cites as examples, are necessary for survival, have anything to do with surviving on an island when there's no adults, no food. And there is this question here that Golding's raising, that power and those in power rest with those who already have that entitled to them in society, rather than those who are most qualified to hold it. Now, we highlighted earlier the repetition of the mob of boys. Earlier, them crying out for a chief, and now them saying a vote, let's vote. And this repetition seems to give us this superficial, safe veneer of democracy. It's almost this idealised version of democracy that voting fixes everything. If you vote for something, it must fix whatever problem is being posed, because if you vote for it, therefore it must come with a simplistic conclusion. Golding, in a slightly sardonic, a kind of harsh sarcasm, undermines that idealism immediately and refers to it as this metaphor of the toy of voting. Voting is being treated as though it's unserious, as though it can be dropped and cast aside really quickly, like a child with a toy just ignoring his or her game and just dropping it at the moment's notice. Very much like democracy itself has been at times on the precipice of being lost and abandoned and cast to one side. So we have this notion straight away, and we have Ralph being positioned as the immediate natural leader, but not for any reason that they can articulate or state clearly. Intelligence, in fact, is aligned to Piggy, and surely intelligence is required for leadership. But crucially, Golding goes on to focus on Ralph's physical attributes. Piggy's intelligence is not enough. He doesn't have the body, the look, the fit of a natural leader, despite possibly being the most qualified and certainly being the most rational of all the boys on the island. So the stillness, the attractiveness, these are all physical appearances, and ignore intellect, ignore rational decision making. So although we have the superficial veneer of democracy, of a vote being held and cast in order to place Ralph in charge, which should make him the right and correct leader because a democratic process has been followed, actually in the act of voting the most qualified person is being ignored and cast to one side. Rationality, reason, scientific thought is already being ignored at this early stage of the novel. Moreover, Ralph at this stage of the novel is aligned with a conch, and in these sentences highlighted in red, the conch is given an almost mystical power. It's this thing of beauty that's not really understood. In fact, it's referred to as this trumpet thing later. So the boys don't really understand what it is and are unable to define what it is. It's described as a delicate thing, and it's there and powerful. So it's as though the holder of the conch is granted this mystical sense of power. And immediately the conch is being associated with power, possibly instead of democracy. Only those who hold it are powerful. Only those who hold it have a political voice on this island and any sense of authority as well. Equally, in the positive sense, this has brought all the boys together when they had been scattered together. But the critical thing to note, because that is a democratic idea of everyone being together, but this union is temporary and it is fleeting and is mutable. It is going to change. It's going to change very quickly and very rapidly at this as we move through this early stage of the novel. So we come back and we see these references to the shell, to this trumpet thing. Again, it's only Piggy that names it correctly. It's only Piggy with the intelligence and the rationality and the knowledge to name what is on the island and to name what he's seeing correctly. And it is this determined ignoring of intelligence and reason and rationality that Golding introduces at this early stage of the novel. Power is moved away from Piggy. Piggy doesn't have any decision-making power or authority. Democracy is sidelined Piggy, but it is only that character who actually offers safety and the way forward in this novel as a whole. And then we have these sort of pre-existing ideas that the boys have come onto the island with Jack as chief. The choristers almost feel this sense of obligation that they have to follow him, that they have no choice about following him. And so questions of power, which should be left to only democracy, are placed under even more critical and more problematic lenses, because here we have Jack, who is bringing along his choristers with him, that they are obliged to follow him. They have no choice but to follow him. They just go along with it. And this and all of these notions then become lost, because actually in following Jack they descend to savagery and their primal instincts, particularly because they become the hunters as well. I mean, it's not just the choristers who fall into line behind their appointed leader. Piggy does too. Piggy doesn't want to vote. He doesn't choose to vote for Ralph immediately and excitedly, but he falls into line with everyone else when he sees that his lone separate voice is not going to gain traction, is not going to gain weight, so he goes along with everyone else. Again, what should be a process of democracy is actually quite quickly breaking down into those who are prepared to follow and those who are not, and at this stage of the novel we have Piggy not feeling safe and able to strike out separately and to voice dissent. We have the circle as well, and circles are this equality of distribution, that power in theory is symbolically being equally distributed. But through the symbolism of this passage you can see that Golding is already undermining all of those ideas, particularly intensely and continually. And then as we come through to the end of the passage, we see that Ralph is assigning the choir to Jack, but they are very quickly repurposed and are referred to as hunters. And it's interesting that hunting quite quickly becomes aligned with savagery, and it's the hunters that are aligned to savagery. It's the upper class boys who most quickly lose their humanity. So, with your close analysis of the passage in place, and you should go away and add to those notes with your own ideas, your own connections across the novel, we are now going to start tracking and tracing ideas through the text. So to do this, you would draw this out yourself. You don't need to print this, and you certainly don't need to use the same quotations. But you put one central quotation from the passage that you've been looking at the top of the page. That's your central quotation, a quotation that seems to capture lots of different ideas. And for me, this one, the toy of voting, was almost as pleasing as the conch, comes first, because it does capture questions of power, of democracy, and of order versus chaos. Voting brings order, but equally the conch is there, so we have this symbol of democracy and power, and we know that later on in the novel the conch is destroyed, so democracy and power disappears and reduces and is lost. So the toy voting, we talked earlier about this as a metaphor. It makes voting seem as though it's for children, as though it's a toy that's easily discarded, and perhaps we're seeing again, as we've already stated, that democracy can be discarded really easily. It's a pleasing object, it's a pleasing symbol, and there's somehow this sense of safety associated with it. And then, as we've already stated, we have the conch as this central symbol for democracy, but it's made more complex than that by Golding because it's also aligned to power. And then it's made further more complex again because its destruction later in the novel demonstrates the total fall of man. The fall from purity to chaos and carnage. The fall from the English gentleman into savagery. And that again reflects the disaster that the entire world had experienced during the course of World War II. And the conch being destroyed equally perhaps suggests there is this acceptance of tyranny as well. So then we break that into three branches so we can track and trace democracy, power, and order versus chaos. So we're going to look particularly at this order versus chaos idea. And I've gone to the moment just after the hunters have slaughtered the sow. And we see this pig head hung down with gaping neck and seemed to search for something on the ground. This is prey that's been hunted. But equally, this process of hunting is part of what leads to the break up of the boys. This savage process, this idiotic process, because they kill a sow. The sow could have given birth to many more piglets and allow them to survive on the island for longer. So we have that as our starting point. The gaping neck, it's this unnatural hole. Nature has been disturbed. The natural order has been disordered by the boys in the most grotesque and violent terms, and Golding keeps these images really violent and really intense, and these images of dismemberment surround the sow and later the symbolic Lord of the Flies. And this is certainly a violent part of the allegory of the novel as a whole. And we've already commented on the fact that it's a stupid act. The sow could have provided the boys with more pigs to eat and to survive for a longer period of time. But equally, by killing the sow, placing the sow's head on the stake, we unleash the Lord of the Flies. We unleash, particularly through Simon, this voice of evil, the voice of Satan, the dark voices that inhabit all of our minds, the dark ideas that inhabit, as far as Golding is concerned, all of humanity. And that sow and the sow's head embodies that. It's interesting, of course, making a further connection across the novel, that only Simon hears and sees that evil. He is the only one perceptive enough to see that evil. And then if we take that another step further on, as Simon stumbles out of the jungle later in the novel, he's killed by the boys as they are imitating the process of killing the pig. And so, moreover, not only do the powerful abuse their power, but the truth speakers and those who can perceive the truth are killed and destroyed in this novel as well. And Simon's death is the moment when that is articulated really clearly and brutally. We'll just go back to this quotation, the search for something on the ground. There is this sense of things being lost, perhaps a lost innocence, a lost humanity, certainly a lost safety. This is a novel about losing humanity, losing what it means to be human, perhaps losing what it means to be English as well, particularly as these are all public school boys from public schools, the elite and the elite part of society. And to lose that sense of order and decorum, to lose British values, Western values, democratic values, is something that Golding traces and tracks through the novel and stresses more and more strongly as the novel goes on, as we see the fall to total chaos. So as we bounce between these quotations, from the toy of voting through to the pig's head, and then trying to retrieve Piggy's glasses towards the end of the novel, and Ralph says to Jack, "You aren't playing the game," there is this confusion between what's a game and what's reality, and Golding has the boys confuse that persistently and consistently. There are lots of references to games and playing, and that's often placed and increasingly placed as the novel progresses with increasingly violent and destructive images that really unpick and unpack a brutality inherent in humanity, this darkness inside humanity. And that's a real concern of Golding's, is the darkness inside all of us, the darkness that we're capable of and the brutality that we're capable of. And the games referred to in the novel perhaps is Golding's symbolic means of firstly disguising that darkness as though the boys are just playing and just being boys, but in the process of playing we see the darkness of humanity revealed. There is also the further notion that Golding is exploring, particularly as the novel reaches its closing chapters, that democracy itself is perhaps being referred to only as a game here, and there is a failure to see that there's a failure by the boys, that Golding has the boys see that there are lives at stake and there are real profound consequences to their decisions and their actions. So what I hope you can see there is the fact that we can track and trace ideas from quotation to quotation across very different parts of the novel, but still looking at what Golding is trying to say about order and chaos. We can play the same game with this question of democracy as well. So the conch explodes into 1,000 white fragments and cease to exist. We have that repeated idea of playing as well. Now, just as a final part to this video, just to kind of show you a little bit more closely allegory and the way allegory allows us to discuss a range of meaning, I thought we'd have a look at at the first fire the boys light that catches the whole forest. And we just have a look at the images here. The small flame stirred, we see them dividing and increasing. So we're seeing this destructive image. Okay, the fire laid hold on the forest, began to gnaw, is eating downwards. So we have this fire and it's being personified as something that consumes, destroys, consumes, and uses up resources. And that's intensified again, that it turns into, as a jaguar creeps on its belly. We have the simile making the fire seem as though it's actively hunting its prey, hunting out the trees. And it develops again into a drum roll that seemed to shake the mountain, as though the world and the natural order itself has been unseated and destroyed because the boys have lit the fire. The boys have set the whole world of the island on fire and started and triggered its destruction. But the critical thing here is yes, the boys are destroying the natural world. That's the top level meaning. But this is really a good example of where allegory, and approaching the text as an allegory rather than just as a simple narrative, helps us to unlock lots of different meanings. So we have, a core central fact of allegory is that each character, object, and event stands for lots of different meanings and messages. So we need to start off when we're thinking about allegory and what it can signal to us, just with the top level connotations and associations. So fire is destructive. It ruins the natural world, it ruins the natural world, it ruins the natural order, but it also leads to chaos. Now, from there, with the world being moved into chaos by the boys' actions, and that's shown to us through the fire, we think of the other chaotic things that happen in the novel, the boys becoming increasingly savage. And we do have that word savage being used at this very early stage of the novel. The knowledge and awe made him turn savage. It's as though in seeing the destruction of nature, man is prepared to throw off humanity itself and become savage, become primal, become instinctual rather than rational, which is what Piggy would have the boys do. There is that sense of man's power over nature, but that it's only destructive. And the flames eat and consume. It's as though this savagery is eating away and consuming the boys, or alternatively being revealed in the boys as well. So that brings to a close our look at issues and themes raised in the opening of The Lord of the Flies, in the first chapter of The Lord of the Flies, but you should be able to see that you can track and trace these ideas across the novel as well. It's really important now that you pick up these themes and these issues, these ideas. You look closely at the passages that we've looked at today in the novel, but also then go on and track and trace them across the text as a whole. I hope this has been a useful video to you all, and I look forward to continuing these with you as we continue through our study of Lord of the Flies.